I bet you didn't know how close we came to nuclear war in 1962. The year is 1962. The world watches with bated breath. A tropical island becomes a tinderbox. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a standoff that nearly plunged the world into nuclear war. Imagine a world on the brink, the United States and the Soviet Union locked in a Cold War struggle. Suspicion and fear hang heavy in the air. A single spark could ignite a global inferno. Cuba, a small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, becomes the focal point of this terrifying game of nuclear chicken. What began as a revolution against a dictator transforms into a geopolitical crisis of unprecedented proportions. The stakes couldn't be higher as the world teeters on the edge of catastrophe. This is the story of how humanity faced its darkest hour and emerged on the other side. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we must first journey back to the aftermath of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies, emerge as superpowers with vastly different ideologies. The US, a champion of democracy and capitalism. The USSR, a proponent of communism and a centrally planned economy. The two titans, wary of each other, engage in a global chess match for influence and dominance. This rivalry, dubbed the Cold War, plays out on multiple fronts. Proxy wars are waged in Korea and Vietnam. An arms race sees both nations amassing vast nuclear arsenals. The stakes have never been higher. The Berlin blockade and the construction of the Berlin Wall further exemplified the deep divisions. The space race becomes another arena for competition, with both nations striving to prove their technological superiority. All these tensions culminate in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when the world teeters on the brink of nuclear war. In 1959, Fidel Castro's communist revolution overthrows Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. The US, wary of a communist state so close to its shores, severs diplomatic ties with Cuba and imposes a trade embargo. Castro, seeking protection from what he perceives as American aggression, turns to the Soviet Union for support. The embargo leads to significant economic hardships in Cuba, further pushing Castro towards the Soviet Union.
Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sees an opportunity to plant nuclear missiles in Cuba, right under the nose of the US.
In the summer of 1962, under a veil of secrecy, the Soviet Union begins shipping nuclear-capable missiles to Cuba. Soviet advisors and military personnel arrive in Cuba to assist with the missile installations. The stage is set for a confrontation that will test the nerves of both superpowers. On October 14, 1962, a US U-2 spy plane, soaring high above Cuba, captures photographic evidence that sends shockwaves through the American government. Soviet nuclear missile sites are being constructed on Cuban soil.
President John F. Kennedy and his top advisors are faced with an unthinkable dilemma, a nuclear threat just 90 miles from American shores. Options are considered, each more dangerous than the last. A full-scale invasion of Cuba could trigger a Soviet response, potentially leading to nuclear war. Diplomacy seems futile in the face of such a blatant provocation. The world holds its breath as the clock ticks down.
The tension is palpable and the stakes have never been higher. What follows is a tense 13-day standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union.
In a televised address to the nation, President Kennedy announces the discovery of the missiles and demands their removal. A naval blockade, which the U.S. terms a quarantine, is imposed around Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments.
The world watches in horror as the two superpowers teeter on the brink of nuclear war.
In Moscow, Khrushchev and his advisors engage in their own high-stakes calculations. Will they back down or stand firm?
Behind closed doors, frantic back-channel negotiations take place. Letters are exchanged between Kennedy and Khrushchev, each leader trying to gauge the other's resolve. The pressure is immense, the stakes impossibly high. The world holds its breath, hoping for a peaceful resolution to this unprecedented crisis.
As the crisis reaches its peak, a glimmer of hope emerges.
Khrushchev, in a message to Kennedy, agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a US pledge not to invade the island. Secretly, the US also agrees to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which had posed a similar threat to the Soviet Union.
The crisis ends as suddenly as it began. The Soviet Union dismantles its missile sites and the US lifts the naval blockade. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though brief, leaves an indelible mark on the Cold War. The resolution of the crisis showcases the power of diplomacy and the importance of communication between superpowers. In the aftermath, a direct hotline is established between Washington and Moscow to prevent such a crisis from happening again. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a pivotal moment in history, reminding the world of the fragile balance of power and the need for ongoing dialogue.